Trump himself has said also repeatedly that part of the reason he's so interested in Cuba is because he's had wonderful Cuban Americans who have supported him. He's appointed many Cuban Americans to diplomatic posts. He has a Cuban American as Secretary of State. And so, and seems to want to do right by them in some way, whatever that means. And that do right by them, for as most Cuban Americans would define it, is not simply having the opportunity to go participate in a hotel venture. And so that's where Trump's kind of deal-making instincts may conflict with some of the domestic political pressure that he's going to get from a place like South Florida. On the other hand, if they are able to craft a deal, as has occasionally been reported, that is basically about economics, and by the way, the Cubans have signaled that they'd be pretty comfortable with that. Their red lines are: don't tell us how to run our political system, don't tell us who to let out of jail. But even if part of the Trump White House is willing to go there, the consequences for someone like the Secretary of State, I think, are significant in terms of his future political ambitions, in terms of electoral support for future Republican candidates in Florida, right? So that's where there's a disjuncture here.
Okay, but Trump doesn't care that much about that, right? I mean, like if I'm thinking about Trump wanting a win on the back of Iran, which has not gone well.
Yeah.
On the back of Venezuela, that has, and those two experiences have been very, very different in terms of level of ambition,
yes.
Right? Then, why wouldn't he take that? And from his perspective, it's another win. It's another war that he gets to say is essentially over, that he's resolved.
He might very well, and I have no doubt.
Do you think that, or you don't think that?
I think Trump might be willing to take that deal any day of the week. I think there are other parties in the administration who also would be, as long as there is, as part of that, some kind of at least superficial political signal, maybe a little bit more than superficial. The Cuban government, say, lets out a number of political prisoners in jail, doesn't commit to democratization overnight, but makes some gestures in the same way that the Delcy Rodriguez government has done in Venezuela, right? But largely, you keep the picture of the state, the same. That might be perfectly sellable for Trump, for many parts of the White House. The question I have, and Rubio himself might be forced to do that if that's what Trump wants. But then Rubio has a question: Does he go along with it, and how does he sell it to his own community? That I think is a really interesting thing to think about. You're right. For Trump, he might not care. Presumably, he doesn't have to run for election again. But again, I think for Rubio, that's where the dynamic is really interesting.